Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of The Suspense is Killing Me. I'm Lucas Marino, your host, and today I'm joined by my buddy, Mr. Chris DiLeo. What's up, Chris?
How are you, man? This is a really cool thing. It's a great pleasure to be here. You're talking about books and horror.
Yeah, man. Empty Devils?
Oh my God! Oh, that's the only copy in existence right now, and you have it in your hands, and it should be in my hands.
Holding it hostage. If it makes you feel better, my kids it was like on the the shelf, the ledge in my kitchen.
Yeah.
And there's like a spot right here, and I lost it. I was like, "Hey!" And they're like, "What?" And I'm like, "The book!" And they're like, "Oh."
They're like, lots of books.
Yeah, you got books everywhere, dude. And I'm like, "No, this is the only one, man."
Right. Yeah.
So,
well,
they don't care.
Actually, if I had it here, I have cats all over the place. So one of my cats would probably start chewing on it, and that would be a little worse.
There you go. What are your cats' names?
So the older cats that we have right now are Ripley, named after Ripley, of course, from Alien, and then Annie Wilkes from Misery, and then we got two new cats, a 1-year-old and a kitten, basically, and we named the 1-year-old Mare after Mayor of Easttown, if you've seen that show with Kate Winslet, and then the little one is Agent Clarice Starling.
Oh.
So there you go.
So much variation in the theme. I think I like Ripley.
Yeah, Ripley's a good name for a cat.
Yeah. I mean, I like them all, but I think Ripley might be my favorite. Don't let her hear me say that.
Yeah. See, she's gotta be around here somewhere.
God, that movie is just such a huge part of my young. What was that? I was probably 10, watching that.
Well, what's really funny about it is I remember my father. So my father loved horror, and I remember him telling me the story. And I was really young at the time, like 8 or 9 maybe, when he showed me Alien, and he told me the story of him seeing it in the theater, and my mother refused to go with him. And so he's just in the theater, and he's sitting there, and the theater's packed, right? And then the guy next to him has this really big soda. And so then you get to the chestbuster sequence, and when that happened, the guy next to him just screamed, and the soda just went all over my father, and he just watched the whole rest of the movie just soaking there. And I was like, why didn't you get up and leave? He's like, I couldn't leave. That was just a phenomenal film. I had to see it.
Oh, that's terrible.
You're just sitting there, all soggy wet, but you don't want to, there was no real VHS or anything. You're not, you were there. You got to watch it then. You didn't know when you're going to see it again.
You paid a good $3 for that ticket back then.
Right. Oh,
if that,
Yeah, a little bit more now.
Yeah. Gosh. That's great, man. That is really cool. Could you imagine seeing Alien or Aliens in the movie theater? I mean, insane.
Well, it would be phenomenal. I also remember, because I was a huge Indiana Jones fan, I still am. He told me when he went to see Raiders of the Lost Ark, and in the famous sequence there where Indy is about to, face off with the guy who's got the giant sword, and then he just shoots him. And I remember my father saying the entire theater just erupted in applause. And how cool to have that communal experience. So
yeah,
it's something I miss from theater going, because I feel like I haven't really had that in a long time.
Well, what you need is to hang out with some of those teenagers you spend all that time with at work. My kids are theater kids, and I feel like we're in theater all the time, which is a blessing, by the way. I love it.
Right.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's really cool that you got that story from Pops, and it's a wild thing that this podcast basically has that community feel to it, Chris. We are just, people are just screaming right now. Wherever they're listening to this, they're just overwhelmed with joy, and they're all yelling, "Don't do it!" or "Shoot the guy!" or whatever. So.
No, exactly. Or it's just Rob, Tone, and Clay just screaming at each other. Yeah, whatever.
So that I can't promise it, but that might be my only dad joke of the episode. But Clay was an absolute blast, and Rob's always such a gift to have on the show, and I just love their personalities. They make hosting so easy, but it's also nerve-wracking because I have no idea
Oh
what's
yeah,
gonna
what's
happen
gonna
when we
happen?
Yes.
So I saw Clay. This was just a couple of weeks ago. He was doing a reading with Sam Rebeline right in Beacon, New York, and I went there. And it's funny because they're talking, the two of them are answering questions, and then it's time to read passages, and they look at each other. And all I was thinking when I was sitting there, I was like, "Oh, Sam, you should go first because Clay is going to be a psychopath."
Yes.
And then Sam's like, "Oh, well, you can go, Clay." And then so Clay goes and he does his whole thing, and it's phenomenal. He has the long passages memorized from "Wake up and open your eyes," and it's phenomenal. He's screaming at everybody, and then Sam goes and he does a great job, but it's still like you're going after Clay. And I was sitting there and I took out my little notebook that I had and I wrote down a couple notes about like writing a revenge story on behalf of Sam about a guy like Clay. And I said, well, if you do this, like I'm telling myself this, if you write this, it's got to be written the way he writes, like this psychotic kind of monologue.
Yeah.
And then I would have to memorize it at some point. And at some point in the future, perform it where I make sure he's in the audience, where he'll be, of course, the victim of whatever happens to happen.
He would love that. He would be the biggest fan of
Yeah.
that. Clay, I don't know if you're ever gonna listen to this, but if you do, now I think Chris is on the books for it, so
Right. Yeah. Like I have a note here that says, this one's for Clay. And then it just says, a writer gets revenge on another writer who upstaged him at a reading.
Well, I think we have to give, like, tremendous props to Sam for being willing to go,
Absolutely.
do a reading after Clay because that has got to be one of the, like, one of the biggest challenges, so Sam, I'm giving you a round of applause, brother. Good job
Yeah,
for
no, absolutely. He did a
taking
great
on
job.
that challenge, man. Good
Yeah.
gosh. I'd be a nervous fit
Yeah.
trying to do something like that. I'm still reading directly out of the book when I do readings. I'm so I need to
Right. That's what everybody else is doing. Clay's the only one where like, doesn't he need a book? Like, what's he doing?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. He's an actor too. So
Yeah.
he just has all of this memorized. It's amazing. It really is.
Yeah, Nat Cassidy does a pretty
Oh
good
yeah. Yeah.
job at that too. And in uh at the horror reader weekend
Hmm.
in Hudson Valley last year, November 24, um, seeing both of them back to back do their,
Oh yeah.
I mean, just fascinating. It's like it's kind of like going to school, you're like, okay, I'm taking notes. I'm
Right. Yeah.
taking notes.
It- and that event was so cool. And again, it
Mhm.
was really close to where I live here. And then I was lucky enough to just be on a panel where we were basically talking like splatterpunk and things like that. And I'm on the panel with Nat and Clay, and it was just crazy. Like I kept
Mm,
thinking, like I'm sitting next to these guys. It
yeah.
was it was really amazing. It really was.
Yeah, that is really cool. Um, Horror Reader Weekend, I guess, is a good time to talk about it because we're already talking about it. Is a really cool event for those that haven't attended it before. Chris and I went to the first one in Hudson Valley, November 2024. They're doing it again
Yeah.
um, in Hudson Valley, November 2025. So if you guys are watching this, and then before that, there's going to be an event May 2nd through 4th in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and we'll be there in force. So, are you coming to that one?
Yeah, I'm hoping to. Absolutely. I'm so in awe of Christine there. Like
Yeah,
all that she's doing. I mean, I feel like she was a guidance counselor,
she was. Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And now she is making quite the name for herself purely just out of the love she has for the genre and the love for other writers and everything. It's really amazing.
Yeah, her social media is fun to follow too. So if you guys haven't followed Christine Harold, you should go check it out. You can look up Horror Reader Weekend, and you'll find her that way if you don't find her by her name. But she's a phenomenal human, great person to know. She's so much fun. She's very honest. She's very supportive, and I'm just happy to be able to support her um, in those events when she gives me the opportunity to. So as are almost every every author I've met that gets to work with her at those events is grateful. So yeah, go check it out. And you could be a reader, you could be an influencer, social media personality or whatever. and go there and have a blast having meals with all these authors and having fun at these readings and these panels. And it's just a really chill kind of intimate environment. And it's some magic that Christine's been able to throw together. So it's pretty
And
cool.
it's crazy the names that she has gotten. I mean, I was starstruck when I'm sitting there, obviously Clay and Nat, but then it's like right next to me where I was selling books. I had, John Langan. And then it's just insane. I'm like, what?
So Chris and I were back to back, like opposing
Yeah,
rows. And I look over and I'm like, that's John Langan. And
right. Yeah,
I don't live up there now, so like
yeah,
I don't, I'm not in Langan country, if you will.
right. Yeah,
And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's John Langan. And he's just so down to earth and it's so easy to talk with. And he's like, hey man, hand me one of your books. And I'm like, yes, Mr. Langan.
yeah. Which one would you like? Here, have them all.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, oh God, he's gonna hate it. Oh God, he's gonna like,
Right. Yeah.
and that's not him, he's just the nicest dude.
Right.
He's looking at it, he's like, this looks pretty cool. I'm like, just
Anyway, it's a great event. Everyone should go.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And if you do go there, you'll see copies of Empty Devils there.
Yes, that's going to
This
be
is
awesome.
Chris's upcoming release from these knuckleheads at So Below Books. And I am biased because I'm one of the two co-owners of the press, but I feel fortunate that I was one of the first people to lay eyes on this story. And when it came through, and I just fell in love with it. I loved everything about it. And I'm just blessed that I feel blessed that you're here to talk about this story because I don't know if it could have been a more relevant time.
Oh,
I mean, it's based on historical events, but it's not a historical fiction.
right.
It's such a cool story. So before we get too far into this, I'm going to go ahead and read the back cover copy if
Right.
it may give you a little relief from having to explain the story. So Empty Devils, it goes as such. With his daughter in a casket and his wife in a cult, David Eden is on the brink of losing touch with reality. So when he begins conversing with his daughter's ghosts and then encounters a nightmare monster in the cemetery that can't possibly be real, but is most certainly deadly, he is convinced he's lost it. But David is also out to get revenge on the white supremacists he blames for his child's death. And he's about to learn that sometimes it takes a monster to defeat one. So cool.
Thank you. Thank you. It sounds great. And I am really biased because I wrote it. And it's crazy though when you're saying like relevant,
Yeah.
because in the author's acknowledgement, I mentioned this right at the beginning there. The idea is coming from like August of 2017 when there was the infamous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and that ended with a white supremacist driving his Dodge Challenger through a crowd, and then injuring several people and killing one woman. And I remember how upset I was by that whole event.
Hmm.
And then Trump won, as I guess we're calling it, when he came out and he said, "Oh, they're fine people on both sides." And I was thinking, I was like, really? What? I mean, what kind of, rhetorical strategy, if you're even using that, are you employing when you're saying this? Like, what are you doing? And so part of me was thinking, like, all right, if I'm the father, right, and my daughter, let's say, happens to go to this event and she's killed, what do I feel? And it's even more than just obviously your child dies, right? But now
Right.
you add on to it this whole other aspect of these white supremacists, these wannabe Nazis, whatever they are, out on this protest, and then this one guy driving his car through, and you're in this country that's already divided on this, and then it just felt like something that I needed to explore. And it was a couple years later when I finally, really started putting pen to paper, but that was even 2019. And it's so crazy to me that it's coming out now, but it like feels like this is when it was supposed to come out all
Mm.
along. which is fitting and also insanely depressing at the same time. When
Right.
I'm thinking about this book and what I was trying to, explore with it. And yeah, it is just as relevant as when I first got the idea.
I think it's one of those things where at first, on the surface, I was a little nervous to read it for the reasons that when you handle something that's real and
Mhm.
so sensitive, someone's death,
Right.
this really happened, but it's not really the same
Yeah.
circumstance. These are real people, but not real people. The the turmoil of the country,
Mhm.
it was so fresh, and it is I mean, its current relevance. It was like this kind of funny thing where I said, okay, a story like this either knocks it out of the park
Yeah.
or it like foul
Strikes
balls
out. Yeah.
and you wipe out the catcher with the swing on the bat, right? So like
Right. Yeah.
I'm like, oh, this is gonna be hopefully this is gonna be done in a way where there's a like a careful but deliberate. It's careful, but it's not. It's got
Right.
a recklessness to it that the story deserves, but you handle the topics very sensitively, which I think is wonderful.
Oh, well, thank
And even some points where I was like, wow, Chris didn't hold back on showing the humanity of everyone around him in this story, right? David Eden is angry
Right.
and he's out for revenge, but he's still human.
Yeah.
It wasn't just this blind rage story.
Right.
And his friend and the people that they encounter in town, and even some of the people that are on the periphery of this group
Mhm.
he's engaging with, particularly the young woman. I can't her name is like slipping right out of my head, but um
Slipping out of my head too, and I wrote I wrote the
a-
book.
as it should. But there's a level of humanity at role in this, or at play in this story, that is found in the people and never in the events, which I think is wonderful because it shows that like we're at the center of all of this. Like there
Right.
is no escaping the fact that all of this is man-made, all of this is man influenced, all of this is man is burdened
Right.
and felt by the people on involved in all of this, no matter who they are. It's just that
Right.
some people carry responsibility and others don't, and then the accountability factor obviously is
Yeah.
huge. So
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Um,
yeah,
it was it was something where I know when I wrote that first chapter, and it probably comes across really well in that opening, that just that bitter rage that I had because I was really trying to imagine what it would be like
yeah,
to be that father. And it's not like he's a high school English teacher like me. He's not a Jack Reacher type. He's not going to go there and be able to kick these guys' butts. He thinks he has a plan, but it's really just this rage. And when I had him go there and confront them right in those opening pages, and I said, all right, well, let's just see what happens. But then, as you were saying, there are repercussions beyond just him, right? And this is affecting everybody else. And then and he even sees that the girl who's there, and of course, that's fitting because of his own daughter. Um, so then it starts to make things a little bit more complicated, and that's when writing really starts to get very interesting from my standpoint when I'm working on a story.
her name is Mercedes.
Ah, there we go.
I just found it, and I like that the point that immediately upon introducing her in the story, you talk about how she could have known
Right,
David's
Penelope.
daughter.
Yeah, yep,
Yeah, I mean, they're the same age, so
yep,
there's a little bit of, like, this empathetic view from him as a dad. He sees
yes,
another girl the same age as his daughter, and he feels a little bit of that, like, fatherly kind of
right,
concern for her, and she actually, at least in my interpretation of her character, appeared to give him a little bit of that daughter-like
hmm,
protection.
right.
But I'm not going to spoil it. Her character is like a kind of teetering on an edge of a lot of life decisions. So,
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
so
there were some very dark moments when I was writing this book, because I didn't really know, like, who knows what's gonna happen here with this plan, and there was a time where things were gonna end really badly for everyone. It can be very tough to find even those slivers of hope when you're just dealing, in just kind of a eternal darkness.
Right.
But I think I was able to find some hope in there, and that made me very happy.
So I think you also demonstrated a lot of professional restraint and tact as a writer and a storyteller, mostly in this point. In not like you mentioned how David's not like a Jack Reacher type. He's
Right.
not showing up and just kicking everyone's ass and
Right.
walking out. But the white supremacists who very clearly have a significant role in what happened to his daughter, they also kind of try to keep him at arm's distance to a certain degree. And I felt like that was also, an equal amount of restraint on your part because it would have been real easy to just
Right.
make them more, in some ways, more aggressive than they were in the
Mhm.
story.
Right.
But I think that lent a lot of reality to it. And it makes the reality of the people like that we have in this world that we have to live and deal with in
Yeah.
an open and free society, it makes it complicated and difficult because they're not just on a rampage.
Right.
They're smart enough to know like how to ride the line. And I
Mhm.
thought you did a really good job of showing that because it could have been real easy. It probably would have been a really short story.
Right. Yeah. Could have been really satisfying though.
Yeah. Could have been real easy for either side to
Yeah.
come out the gate like hyper violent. You know, David in his initial approach and the supremacist in their initial reaction. And
Right.
so I was like, wow, this is actually showing a lot of maturity as a storyteller to let that kind of foundation settle before you built a story on it. I thought that was really good.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, man.
It was it's funny because I was listening to another podcast. It might have been one of the Stephen Graham Jones's numerous podcasts, where he was talking about empathy and talking about the villains, and trying to avoid that kind of cardboard type of villain who's just all evil. And it's funny, in that opening chapter is, again, when people read that, they'll see like the first white supremacist that David encounters here is a more typical, like, oh, okay, Chris is just going to mock them, and here's just a moron kind of thing. And he's having, a little fun with it. And it's like, all right, that's fine. We can mock them and whatnot. But then there's another guy who comes out to see what's going on. And then when Joe arrives, um, I was really like, oh shit, like I was terrified because I was like, this guy is not some huge guy who's just gonna kick David's ass. He's smart, he's well educated, he knows what he's doing, like he's not afraid to get his hands bloody, but he's not just gonna be like that other meathead and
Right.
throw down. And that added this whole other element. And at that moment, I really, when I was writing it, I was thinking, well, I don't know if David's gonna, again, he's no Jack Reacher. David's not gonna be clever enough here to
Mm.
figure out how to get through this. So I guess we'll just keep going, because I can't suddenly just make the bad guy weak, because then it's not gonna feel earned. It won't feel realistic.
Right. Yeah. No, I thought you did a wonderful job at that. And I've immediately picked up on that. And I think it was a sign of your maturity as a storyteller because you didn't reach for the easy lever, you went for the hard one.
Well, thank you.
And you did it
Sometimes you
well.
get hurt that way.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it comes with risk. That's for sure.
Sure.
So, so tell me a little bit about that. I mean, I'd like to unpack that just a little bit because when you write villains or antagonists in stories, I feel like sometimes going a little far is justified, and then
Right.
other times showing restraint like you did is actually is like masterful, right? It's like that's actually crafting a character the way it it most likely would be, and it
Mm,
lends value to the story. When you encountered him, uh, this leader amongst these poor, these souls that have strayed
right,
far from where they should be, you kind of have to come face to face with this person because you're responsible for them.
right.
When you built him, did it take time for you to sit with this person and say how far, like how do I want this person to act across the story arc? Because it doesn't stay there in that first scene,
Right. Yeah.
and his behavior gets a little inconsistent at times
Right.
in a way that it should.
Right.
There's no fault in that. But it is tactful and it isn't deliberate progression of his character. Almost like he's like you said, he's smart enough to not show his hand
Right.
early in the story, but then he can only not show it, but
Right.
so much later. So what
Well,
was that like? Kind of figuring how exactly to manage that.
it's funny because I knew that I had to have, like, when he shows up on the scene too, and I have David's first conclusions. Like, he looks at him, and and there he is, you know, in his tank top or whatever, and he's walking this dog, and he's immediately assuming that this dog is probably the product of abuse and all these other things. But then all of a sudden, he's like, "Oh wait, the dog seems like it actually is very happy. Seems like he cares for the dog." So then that brings up the classic, situation that many other authors have mentioned, where it's like this is where it gets complicated. You could have a serial killer character, let's say, who then goes out of his or her way to walk an old lady across the street and make sure she's safe.
Mm.
Right there is these built-in contradictions that I think all of us have to some degree or another. So we seem like well, that doesn't fit, but it really does fit when you take the whole character. Um, but with Joe, the scene that really did it for me, and I was writing it, and then I was working on it, and I remember I was out somewhere, and I just had my notebook with me, and just it was something along the lines of like, this is what America is, or let me tell you what makes America different. It was something along those lines. The line just popped in, and I said, "Oh my God, that's Joe speaking right now." And
Mm.
I sat down and I started to write out what eventually became this really nasty monologue that he
Mm.
gives later on in the book. And as I was writing it, I said, "Oh, this is who this guy is." And then I could go back through it with that as like a guiding principle for who he is. And so when he's saying those things, when he finally lets that all out, that's the core of what makes him up. And it reminds me of like some of my favorite moments that I think are so impactful in movies, let's say, are when the villain actually gives a speech explaining who they are and what they believe. And part of you is like, I sort of get what he's saying. So I think of like Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, right?
Mm.
Greed is good. Greed, for lack of a better term, blah, blah, blah. And we know, like, I'm watching, I'm like, he's the villain. But part of your mind is saying, but he has a point. And so it was a really upsetting thing, actually, when I was writing it and thinking like, all right, I'm writing something. And it occurs to me now too, when I'm like, I'm writing something that, you could literally take his speech that's in there, and somebody who has that ethos that he has could deliver that same exact speech. I'm like, oh, this is pretty good. This guy gets it. But but it's like, that's the really scary thing about writing. If you're really going to try to do it, it's an act of empathy, and I have
Yeah.
to see through whose ever eyes it is, even at the time that I'm like, all right, well, you're the villain, but I don't want you to be cartoonish. So it was a challenge in that sense. But once I got that monologue, once it came to me, essentially, he really fell into place.
Mm. I love it. Yeah, that was a really that kind of stood out to me at first about the characters. The other thing that stood out to me, and I think she deserves some time on the show for sure, is Penelope.
Yes. Yeah.
It's always tricky when you have to deal with someone that can't represent themselves in the moment because she's obviously gone.
Right. Yes.
right? So we start the story knowing that David's daughter is gone,
Right.
that she is the victim of this terrible crime, because that's what it is. It's a crime,
Yes.
and it's an unjust action, and so
Right.
there's a lot of wrongs that have been done here, and we want to tell the story of Penelope, and we want to get to know her, but there's do we do flashbacks? Do we have visitate? Like, is it in his mind the whole time? He's just recalling things.
Mm,
Do we leave this time frame? And I think you did a really good job of kind of weaving her into the story in a way where I never felt like I was leaving David
mm.
to do it. So whether
Right.
it's a memory or thoughts that he's having, um, I never felt like he was out of arm's reach. I felt like I was with him through the whole story, and there wasn't this jarring did you have to fight this urge to have like chapters of just her POV? You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's what's funny is somewhere on this computer in my little file here for Empty Devils, there is a one page. There's one page that exists that is
Okay.
from her point of view, that I wrote of her at the protest
Mm.
where the terrible event goes down, and it was fascinating, and I was like, oh, this would be an interesting way to start the book, to start with here, and then I had it like the experience was connecting with something when she was young, so I was introducing her father kind of that way through
Mm.
her. But then it really became like, no, it's David's story. So then it was really the challenge of, okay, how do you go about exploring this grief and make Penelope a real character, and then like she's there with him almost the whole time, but and her personality changes a little bit as well. So then I kind of want the reader to be like, well, who was she really? In a sense. But one of the very first things that I ever wrote of this book wasn't even that opening chapter. It was the scene, I think it's like chapter 3 now, maybe, where he goes home. Yeah, I went home where my daughter was waiting for me. And in that sequence, she's like sitting on the kitchen counter. And then she jumps off the counter while they're talking, and he sees her age, like in reverse, and all these memories are just woven together. And I remember when I wrote that longhand in a notebook, and I remember looking at it and saying, "Well, I think that's really good."
It feels good. It doesn't feel forced.
Right.
It feels like a natural progression. And what I liked about this was I have this terrible fear, and this is probably just like a human thing. I'm not unique in this regard. That my memories aren't exactly what they are. Like,
Right.
our brain plays with what it owns, and it owns these memories, and it is doing its magic with them, despite our
Mm.
or our best efforts to retain many of them exactly as they occurred. And so there's this, like, I guess you could say, unintentional but also uncontrollable behavior that our brain has when it comes to the treatment of memory and people that we love. And the more time we spend away from them in their physical form, the
Right.
more that kind of takes hold.
Mm.
And so, you hear about people saying, "Oh, I don't know that I can really remember the face of this person after a certain time period." And it could have been like their spouse or their child.
Yeah.
They start to doubt whether they're remembering them exactly as they were.
Mm.
I think that's a lot less prevalent now that with the technology we have, the
Right.
proliferation of digital media. We can see a bazillion pictures of someone on our phone throughout the years, um, but those memories, they blur, and
Mm.
they kind of take form and they move. And so with him experiencing her, I felt like I was experiencing like a time warp movement,
Right.
which was very natural, like kind of went hand in hand with the way our brains treat us.
Right.
So yeah, I thought that was a really fun way for me to kind of experience it.
Well, thank you. No, that's definitely, when I was writing or when I was revising and going through, I'm always so fascinated by memory as well, because we we very rarely remember things chronologically.
Hmm.
Like things have an emotional pull towards us, and then we just jump from one moment to the next. And sometimes we can't always tell what that connective tissue is. So,
Hmm.
like when I have her kind of changing like that, it was also the idea of like that, plus this notion of so she's been alive for, 2 decades or so, and that's all you have
Yeah.
of her. And so then his mind is it's almost like, and of course, this happens for anybody who has lost someone who's close to them, your mind starts screwing with you.
Yeah.
It almost feels like the grief is punishing you, right? And so, well, these images would normally be comforting. If he was like looking through a photo album and she was still alive, everything would be fine. But because she's not, it becomes this terrible, torturous moment, and and then he's just alone in the house.
Yeah. Hey,
This,
which
yeah,
one's that?
that is Agent Starling.
Agent Starling. Hello. Kat Silva was on the show, and her cat jumped right up like in front of the camera, and we were laughing because she was just like, "Yeah, we're done. It's my turn. It's my turn to talk now." Okay, one more character that I kind of wanted to talk a little
Yes.
bit about. Before that, though, is there anything about Penelope that you wanted to mention that we haven't discussed, or any
Well,
treatment of her that you kind of wanted to make a point of?
well, I think there's really two things that I'll say
Mhm,
about it. One is that I don't have any children,
mhm.
so I've never known what it's like to be a father, and this comes up all the time when I'll do readings because terrible things happen to children in all of my books. It seems that way anyway, and somebody will always ask, "Well, why do you have this? You seem to have bad things happen to kids." And I mean, one answer is that I started reading Stephen King really young, and kids are always in peril in those books, right? But the
Yeah.
other one is I really feel and I really feel like that was a major fear that I've always had. Like when
Mhm.
my wife and I were discussing, having kids like 10 years ago or whatever, that was definitely there. Like you think about the love that you have for your child, and then to imagine anything bad happening, and then imagine the worst possible thing that can happen. And, how do you deal with that? And so writing this character was an effort almost to explore it for myself to see in that way, and could I be honest about it? Will someone read it? And obviously, people who have kids, like parents, will read it, and will they find it to be believable, or will they think that I'm not getting it? And I hope that I am getting it, obviously. And then the other thing I'll say is when I was doing the edits on this book when we were basically going through it in those early stages, and you and Les had such great advice, and then one of you recommended, oh, you got to read Clay's book, you know Kill Your Darling. And I immediately bought it, and man, son of a bitch, that writer Clay is so good. It pissed me off so much because I was in such awe of him. Like I can't even
Yeah.
explain. I read that book so fast. It's a
Mhm.
novella, so it's like 40,000 words. I read it so fast because it is an absolute masterclass in just writing, period. But and it specializes in the grief horror, and it's about somebody losing their child, and there's an even older guy, so he's in his 70s, and he takes a great writing course, so there's a whole meta thing going on in there, but he doesn't let that take too much control. It shows pure mastery of craft. And when I read that, and then we were doing the development edits, I really said, okay, well, you guys basically said I have like 4 or 5,000 words to play with to stay in the novella range, and I was like, all right, I need to up my game. Like, I'm not going to get close to Clay's brilliance, but man, am I going to try, because it was just like a throwdown. And I'm like, all right, I've got to try to bring it. And I went back to a lot of those scenes throughout the book, specifically with Penelope. And I thought of the emotions that Clay had brought out in me when I was reading his Kill Your Darling. And I really tried to do the best that I could in my story and bring that out. And I really hope that I was successful.
Mhm.
And I hope if Clay ever hears this or manages to read this book, that he takes this as the compliment that it is.
I will have to we'll have to find him, and then we'll just, duct tape a copy of the book around
Right.
him.
Yeah.
Uh,
He'll appreciate that. Yeah.
yeah, you know, credit to Les on that one, because, he had gotten to the story before I did, to Clay's story, and he said, "Have you read this?" And because he knows I write a lot of grief horror, and I was like, "No, I'm dying to read it. Don't, like, don't
Right.
don't
Yeah. Don't
don't
ruin it.
don't do this
Yeah.
to me, man." And he's like, "Yeah, you're gonna really, enjoy this." But, like, he had
Yeah.
shared the same thoughts. It was just so well done. So, shout out to Les for pointing that out, and shout out to Clay for writing that story. And Clay's episode, if you guys haven't watched it, a few episodes back, I interviewed Clay McLeod Chapman, and we talked a bit about grief horror for a few minutes, and some of his thoughts on writing and experiencing grief horror. So go check it out. Okay, last last character I wanted
Yes.
to ask about. Tell me about Corbett.
So Corbett is fascinating. So that is David's friend and colleague,
Right.
right? And it's fascinating. So I it's so funny because I want to like ask myself, like, did you do what you did intentionally, right? Or
Uh-huh.
did Corbett just arrive kind of on the scene? So it's like I go back to, we have that opening chapter we were talking about, and then the second chapter is him actually going to her funeral, right? Because he was supposed to be there. Instead, he went to go confront these, neo Nazis. And then he's there, and he's looking at the coffin, he's looking at all the people that are around there. And then all of a sudden, among those people, there is Corbett, one of his friends and his colleagues, um, who is also black. And so then it became really fascinating. And I said, all right, well, you're setting up this is me talking to myself. You're setting up a fascinating dynamic here, Chris. Like, what are you going to do with this? And now, all right, so you're already writing a book, first person, whatever, high school English teacher, middle aged male, got that covered, but you're not a father, right? And you're certainly not a neo-Nazi, so you're gonna have to you stretch your mind with that one. And then you're obviously not a person of color either. So it really just became this idea of like I hesitated for a second, but then I said, no, I'm not going to hesitate because this is this world, this is this character, this is his friend,
Mhm.
and then I'm going to say, all right, well, let's see what happens, and let's just follow the character, and let's just try to be honest with it. And he was such a fascinating character because he feels these deep emotions for his friend,
Mm.
but he's also not afraid to just almost like grab him and be like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, stop screwing up all this shit. Like, everybody needs a friend like that in
Yeah,
their life, right? To be
yeah,
like, you know what? You're causing all kinds of problems. You're only making this worse for yourself. The grief is going to destroy you. You know, get your shit together. And of
right.
course, if my friend tells me that after my daughter or my wife has died, I'm going to tell them to go F themselves. Right. Right.
Yeah,
I'm not going to be like, oh, you're right. I'm going to fix everything.
right.
You know, but it really brought out the idea of this emotional journey didn't just have to be David alone in the house with the
Mm.
ghost of his daughter, that it could actually bring in, other characters, and it helped really to set up a finale that I think was also very effective.
Yeah, and I thought Corbett played a key role in the level of isolation that David would experience
Mhm.
because he doesn't have his wife in this,
Right.
as a partner in this story. He is not returning to work and doing all the work things yet.
Right.
he doesn't have a social life, from what I could tell in this story, outside of, you know, or if he had one, it doesn't matter anymore.
Right. Yeah.
So he's got Corbett, and then he's got his isolation and his life. The only people he really confides in or talks to
Right.
are Corbett, Penelope,
Right.
himself.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but outside of them are his enemies.
Right.
And so he has this fairly isolated existence in this story. And Corbett is like the respite. Like he's like the only kind of like not dead, not neo-Nazi,
Right. Yeah.
like not crazy cult influenced
Right.
spouse. Like Corbett's like the
That's a
normal
great
dude in
point.
the story.
That is a great. He's almost like, oh, this is a normal guy.
Yeah, I was like, hey, check this dude out. It's like he was almost like this baseline that helped
Oh, that's
kind
true.
of
Yeah.
show how far everyone else is from the baseline in the story,
That is. It's
right?
funny too. It's always so funny too when like my students when we're reading something in class and and I'll say whatever, oh, this is the author is probably doing this, and a kid will be like, maybe that's not what the author intended. You don't know what the author intended. And it's really funny because it has happened to me now a few times where someone will be talking to me about something I've written and I'll be like, oh my God, you're making an amazing point that I never thought of, but I wrote the damn thing that you're talking about.
Well, I've read it a few times.
So it's like there's always this strange magic, I guess, when
Mm,
you are writing and a story is working,
yeah.
where it's like forest from the trees kind of thing, where I'm not even seeing Corbett other than just Corbett as the character that he
Mm,
is, as this guy who has a wife and a kid and he loves his friend and he cares deeply about his friend. But everything you're saying makes such perfect sense that
yeah.
then this is where I start to sound like the English teacher, right? He's like the foil for David here,
Yeah.
right? And you have the juxtaposition of the two characters, right? This is where my kids are like, oh God, not again with the
Come on,
juxtaposition.
Mr. DeLeo.
Exactly. We know, we know. I'm like, but isn't it great?
Look how excited I am about it.
Yeah.
Why aren't you excited about it?
Yeah.
They'll remember that though. They'll be like, I had this English teacher. The guy loved his job.
Right. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. He was crazy. Yeah. Which side note will be really funny too, because if any of my students read this, because the main character is an English teacher,
Mm.
there's a whole ton of Shakespeare throughout the book as well.
You're
So it's like I found a way to force them to read the Bard.
I was about to say you're getting to the point I was going to ask about. Once we got done with the characters, I was going to have to touch on the last and most prominent character that's not an
Yeah.
actual character, and that would be Shakespeare.
Shakespeare, good old Shakespeare.
Yeah. So before we do that, though, with Corbett, that observation about him being the baseline was something that didn't dawn on me until I think I was sitting there trying to figure out why he was so different from everyone else besides the physical attributes that we've already discussed. And I thought, you know what it is? He's not a white supremacist.
Right.
He's not a teenage girl. He's
Right.
not a grieving father. He's not
Right.
married to a cult. He's not in a cult. I'm like, this basically gives, it's almost like a compass check,
Right. I could see that. Yeah.
and he's also involved in scenes though, which we will not spoil for the reader,
Yeah.
that hold the magic
Yeah.
that unravels in this story. And in some ways, he's like the only person David can confide in about
Right.
that. But
Yeah.
he's also like, yeah, okay, because he is kind of the baseline. And then when it all unfolds, he's like, oh, so like
Yeah.
there is this enjoyment I had in
Right.
reading him from, because it is kind of like a side, kind of like he's obviously a secondary character.
Right.
Um, there was an enjoyment in his reactions and in his part of his role in his relationship with David that just gets better, I think, as the story goes on because of the events getting less
Right.
and less predictable.
Right.
Which I just thought that was great. So there's
Well,
that
thank you.
enjoyment.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
moment in there too, just a little moment later on in the book where, again, we're going with the whole neo-Nazi thing, and then the police are involved. And writing that scene, I like felt Corbett's joy, like, and I was like, oh, this added a whole other element to it, because David was in what he's in, and there's no way that he can fully enjoy what's happening.
Mhm.
But Corbett being, as you were saying, like the baseline or outside of it, like that, could really kind of revel in what was happening at that moment.
Yeah. Also, I like the fact that you were like the cops, the way they felt about everything.
Yes.
That was perfect. Because they're a soft target, you know?
Oh, easily.
You
Right.
could have
Yeah.
you could have flipped the police one way or the other. I mean, they could have been
Right.
sympathetic to one side or the other. They could have been flippant. They could have been more
Right.
or less concerned.
Right.
I thought you handled their presence in the story very well as well.
Oh,
So,
excellent.
yeah,
Thank you.
very, very good, man.
Thank you.
So Shakespeare.
Yeah, Shakespeare.
How big a fan of Shakespeare is Chris DiLeo? I mean, are you like the Shakespeare fan? Like, do you
So,
feel like all literature revolves around Shakespeare, or do you just like really felt inspired to like inject him into this story?
So what's really funny about this is I think I always liked Shakespeare. Yeah, I was that nerd, in high school who, like, I loved Macbeth, and then I
Oh,
loved Hamlet when we read it in high school, and then I became an English teacher. And the first few times I taught Macbeth, I don't think I fully understood what was going on,
right.
and I was confused. And so then it's actually really funny because I've been teaching for 20 years, and it was only like, oh, I don't even know, 5, 6. Well, it was just before this, so it would have been, all right. Let's give myself some credit here. Let's say 10 years ago, when I had an insane epiphanous moment, right? Like I
Oh,
could look at Shakespeare and I could teach the kids and be like, oh, the brilliance of the language, the way the stories are put together. I was reading Macbeth and I got really into it, and I was teaching it to my AP kids, and I can't even really explain it other than using the word epiphany, where things just clicked for me. And I was like, oh my God, this moment that he's mentioning right here, like this line directly relates to this line. And this line is a metaphor riffing off that's setting up this with this character. And I remember sitting down and being like, this guy knows what he's doing. Like, this is truly masterful work. And it was hilarious because, like, obviously everybody, it's Shakespeare. But up until that moment, it was always just like, oh yeah, no, it's Shakespeare. It's good. I like the violence and everything. He's got some good lines.
yeah.
And then it just clicked in a way that I never would have expected. And
Mhm.
from there, I started to go back through a lot of his other plays, and find other things that I never expected to find. So then when I had this book, I said, all right, well, let's just make him an AP English teacher like me, and let's give him, a focus on Shakespeare. And it's crazy because Shakespeare is so good and the quotes are so good that they apply in so many different ways. And it's funny because a lot of the stuff in here riffs off of Macbeth, because
Mhm.
that is the one that I'm so enamored with. But if you were to choose a play, if you were to consciously say, like, oh, I'm going to write grief horror, that probably wouldn't be the one you would use. That
Mhm.
would be the one you'd use if you're just going to write about a tyrant, right? Who, has his fall or is encountering witches or whatever. You'd be more likely to use Hamlet, let's say,
Yeah.
right? Because of the grief there, and then the suicide thoughts and all of that. And so I remember thinking as I was writing it, like, I consciously thought of that. Like, is this really working? I was like, you know what? I think it's going to work because David loves Macbeth as much as I love Macbeth. So we're just going to make it work. And then I think it does work.
It works wonderfully. I thought it was great. And it was funny because it kind of injected this level of um maybe subconscious like experience that David has because he lives in that world all day. It's
Right.
always on his mind,
Yeah.
like I mean, one of the things we always get accused of in the service was that like you live your job. So
Right.
it's all that you talk about and think about and all these things.
Yeah.
And people are like, "God, when you guys get together, you just tell sea stories, and you do this and
Yeah.
do that." And it's like, well, yeah, it's because that's all I've got. It's like
Right.
I'm,
Exactly.
I'm out at sea for 250 days a year or whatever. And then there's other people that are
Right.
like, when I go home, I don't want to talk or think about any of this.
Yeah. No.
Those
Exactly.
same people, when they get together, are the ones telling sea stories. So it's kind of
Yeah.
like this, like, dyed in your personality. It
Yes.
influences
Yeah.
the way you think. And if I was reading and teaching Shakespeare all day,
Right.
that would be, it would keep rolling
Right.
in your thoughts. I thought it was great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's funny too because it's like I didn't necessarily do the easy obvious ones like Macbeth's tomorrow speech kind of thing, which would have been a really low hanging fruit kind of
Mm.
thing. But there's other parts like when he's got this whole thing with Penelope there, which added another layer to it, where she like came back from the pool or whatever, and her hair is wet, and then she like does this with her hair, and he says, "Don't shake thy gory locks at me," and then that takes on a whole other meaning when she's a ghost, and all the other crazy stuff that happens in this story.
Yes. Yes. It's crazy. I mean, and we did the cover on this in a very intentional way. We didn't want to give away a lot of the elements that we
Right,
haven't necessarily spoken about. We've retained the spoiler proof um, cover, but we're definitely pointing towards some pivotal scenes
right,
in the book that kind of revolve around this one element of the story that caught me a little off guard when it first started,
right.
but I adored the way you did it. So I'm just gonna put a list of things out there. I'm shooting off the top of my head. So if I forget something
Yes,
or I miss something,
yeah,
correct me. We have white supremacists.
yes,
We have evil humans. We
yes.
have bad humans that are trying to be better, that have the potential to be better, but they don't. We have just genuinely broken people
Right.
that are good people that are trying to get better.
Yeah.
We have ghosts.
Yes.
We have memories that
Yes.
feel like ghosts,
Right.
may or may not be ghosts. We have this is the fun
This
of it.
book sounds crazy.
It sounds great, doesn't it? It's like all of this is very clear, though. I don't want to make a point that there's no confusion in this. I'm just trying to do this in a way that doesn't give spoilers. But we
Right.
also have a magical element of this story that we are
Yes.
not explicitly stating because of the spoiler factor, that I think you handled really well, because there's this magic that comes with childhood.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
as a
Yeah.
parent or a guardian, you're experiencing that magic from a peripheral view of,
Yes.
like, you're
Yeah.
working with your child on these things or talking to them about these things, and
Right.
they tell you all this crazy stuff,
Yeah.
and you're kind of laughing about it, and you're like, wow, you're in that, like, wow, the beauty of a child's imagination.
Right.
But what role does that potentially play
Right.
later?
Exactly.
And I thought that that was fascinating. You caught me off guard with this,
Yeah.
but I was happy about it.
Well, that's good.
Right? I wasn't caught off guard and like, "Oh god, what are we doing?" I was like, "Oh, that's
Yeah.
really cool." So, I have to ask you, like, what influenced you, or what made you think to incorporate this very magical kind of element of childhood as
Right.
part of the story's, like, key factor and resolution later? Like, where did that come from? Where did that idea come from?
So when I was working on this book, for a while there was I consciously had to ask myself, all right, do you want to have this other element or do you not want to have it? Because, in that opening chapter, I was trying, to flex my Elmore Leonard, muscles a little bit, and then I was like, well, you're certainly not Elmore Leonard, so you're not going to be able to pull that off for a full book. But part of me is like, but if you try that other thing, you could really make a mess of this book, and it's just going to be a disaster, and it's just going to fall on your face, and no one's going to like it, and that's going to be that. And so I was a little terrified of
Mm,
doing that, and then I said, well, you know what? I'm not capable of writing the other way. I'm not skilled enough. So let's go with what is there, and let's do it. Let's just chase my fear and see what happens. And then as that evolved, something else, that other part that I'm going to be really vague about, that other part really just happened in the magic of writing. And I
Okay,
was
gotcha.
like, oh my God. It was like it was like the epiphany again. I see what's happening here.
Gotcha.
So it was like going from battling myself and not knowing what to do to then just embracing the story and following the story and letting it take over and show me
Mm.
what it wanted to be.
A little insider baseball on this, which is a rare occurrence on the show because normally I don't edit the book that we're talking about. But in between the original draft and the final version, there was a even more um, of this adapted into the book, and I was again caught off guard because I don't read. I like to go in blind.
Yeah.
So when I read it, I was like, "Oh wow, we're putting some juice on it." You know,
Yeah.
you didn't fall back or like remove or like get risk averse. You were like,
Right.
"Let's do it, man." You committed, and I thought it was great. So
Well, thank you. I really hope people think it's also great.
they'll love it.
Because now I'm thinking like other parts. I'm like, oh shit, yeah, you're right. I didn't pull back. I was like, no, we're going for it. Let's just
Yeah,
go for it. Let's go full tilt and let's just see what
yeah. I
happens.
mean, because it really does add a level. It changes the story because it's not just a two-dimensional or even three
Right.
like horror or grief
Right.
horror book.
Yeah.
I think sometimes grief horror gets a there's a perception
Right.
that grief horror is just going to be about stabbing you in the heart for 60,000 words and then walking away. And this story, although it's heavy on the grief, it's not about the grief. It's
Right.
about everything in the
Yeah.
story. There's so much more to it than just feeling bad. So I guess I'm saying that to give people this like a little bit of insight into this story will entertain you in ways you don't expect. And it
Right.
has layers and depth to it that felt a bit like 80s nostalgic without at all trying to be 80s nostalgic.
Right.
I know
Yeah.
you weren't writing like
Yeah.
that, but the movies we grew up with,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
magic in those movies, the feeling, the supernatural, the
Yeah.
science fiction, all this stuff was like kind of in a very particular way molded together
Right.
back then. And I could feel some of that magic when I was
Yeah.
reading it. I'm like, oh, this feels good. I feel like this Spielberg, right?
Right.
Grief horror,
Right. Well, and it's funny because this goes back to how we started here, where I mean, it was really my father
Mm,
who introduced me to all of these things, right?
mm,
So, he shows me Alien, he shows me the Indiana Jones films, he shows me Jaws, and all of those things, they really have a very significant part in my heart and in my creative heart as well. And it's, you know, I was like, all right, well, this is what love is. So let's just go there.
love it. Love it, love it, love it. Okay. I'll share this opening quote real quick. What's done can't be undone by Sir William Shakespeare. Was he a Sir William Shakespeare? Or was
I don't know if he was actually. What's funny about this? See, we'll just go into a whole other. This is the bonus round of the podcast,
what
right?
have I done?
Yeah, you shouldn't have said that. This is the problem. So, right, this is where it becomes kids will, yeah, a kid, because I teach the AP kids, so they're very bright kids, and one of them will always have a moment where they'll raise their hand. Yeah, what do you have to say? And they'll be like, well, what do you think? Because some people say Shakespeare wasn't even real, and it's great because I always double down on this. I'm like, well, it could have been several different people. It could have been a woman. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that it would have been someone of a much higher status than who they claim this guy William Shakespeare was, and a highly educated guy. And then I always say the same thing. I was like, I really don't care who the man was or the woman was or whatever. We have the work, and
Yeah,
the work is what lives on, and that is where the magic will reside. And I can always see the kids are just like, okay, all right, I could go with that answer. Okay,
I love
proceed,
it.
Mr. DeLeo.
Yeah. You've satisfied my curiosity temporarily, as a teenager does.
Right. Yeah.
Um, So yeah, I just I love the story. I love the book. It was a blast to work with you on this, and I can't wait for the world to read it. They can get their hands on it starting March 25th, 2025. And we will have Les and I will be representing copies at AuthorCon. So if you guys are going to AuthorCon, swing by the So Below table, and we'll hook you up with copies of Empty Devils. And then you and I are going to be running into each other at Horror Reader Weekend in
Yep,
Fredericksburg, Virginia.
absolutely.
All right.
I look
And
forward to that. That'll be fun.
we'll have other copies of Chris's books will be on.
Ooh, very
Gotta
nice.
make sure I get them all in here.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, Children of Fire. Here we go.
Yeah, so things don't go well for kids in that one.
And I get a lot of crap when people interview me or talk to me. They're like,
No, I
burn the
bet.
girls,
Right, yeah.
bury the child.
Yeah, what the hell is wrong with you?
What is wrong with you? why, why are you doing these things to these people? And I'm like, I don't know. They were fun titles.
Because bad stuff can happen, people. That's the whole point.
That's right. That's horror. All right, Chris. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me today. Thanks for helping me uh, unpack the many folds and wonders of Empty Devils. And I just encourage everyone to go out there, get a copy of it. If you can't find a copy, you reach out to me or Chris, and we'll get you a copy.
Damn straight.
And Chris, thanks just so much for taking the time out of your really busy life, man, and meeting outside of your normal hours to make this happen. Appreciate you.
It's my absolute pleasure. This was a blast. Thank you very much for everything.
All right, man. Where can people find out about you?
I am all over the social media, but mostly I'm now on Blue Sky at author DiLeo. I'm usually there or on Instagram, or you just type in Chris DiLeo. If you Google me, as all my students do all the time, and they show me pictures, and they're like, "Look, you're online." I was like, "Yes, I know." Which, side note, I realize we're ending right now, but there's two lines of thought about this. There's the teachers who don't want kids to access any of their stuff online. And then there's my belief where I just flood the online world so the kids can't find anything that they can use against me because I'm just putting all my goofy pictures out there anyway. But that's where you can find me.
That sounds like a challenge, kids.
Yeah, exactly. The gauntlet has been thrown down.
Yeah. I love it, man. All right, guys. Well, thanks, Chris, again for hanging out with us. We appreciate you, brother. Go out and get a copy of Empty Devils. Pick up every one of Chris's other books while you're at it. Why not?
Why not?
And we'll see you guys next week.